Hello, my name is EOA, and as a lot of you know, I like playing Hypixel Skyblock. At this point, I have over 1800 hours on my main profile, and all of that time has given me quite a lot of experience with the game, whether that's from making money or knowing what kind of gear is good and what kind of gear is not. I know a little bit about pretty much everything there is to know, and this includes stats. So that's why today I want to take you on a little deep dive into all the different kinds of combat stats there are in Hypixel. Everything from your health to your strength, your crit damage, as well as some hidden stats that you might not know about or you might have heard about but just don't really know how it works. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video and let's just get right into it. The first stat we're going to take a look at is your health, which is quite simply how much damage you can take before you die, making it quite important. A lot of your health is just simply going to be coming from your gear, such as your armor and your equipment pieces. Another large part of it is going to be your skyblock levels, especially as you get up into higher levels. More and more of your health is going to be coming from your skyblock levels. Your skills also do grant quite a lot of extra health, as well as enchants are really good, especially in the early game, for getting your health up. Otherwise, hot potato books are also really good. Most of the time, you shouldn't be focusing on getting your health up on its own, as that you kind of are going to be increasing throughout the entire game, as there's a lot of smaller activities such as bestiary, essence upgrades, accessory bag upgrades, and slayer levels, which all grant a decent amount of health just passively, as well as your skyblock level, of course. The next stat we have is defense. And while defense kind of does the same job as health, it is a little bit more complicated since it functions as a damage reduction instead of just being a base value that you increase. The most important concept you have to learn very quickly when you get into Skyblock is going to be the concept of effective health. And effective health is more or less just the amount of damage you can take before you die, and it accounts for both the damage reduction you get from your defense as well as your current maximum health. More or less, in simpler terms, is that the higher effective health you have, the more tanky you are, and the more likely you are to survive a hit. In general, defense is quite similar to health in that you're going to get the majority of it from your gear, such as your armor mainly. You will also get a little bit from just your mining skill, but otherwise there aren't really many ways you can increase your health. There's a couple smaller ways, such as getting some talismans and the Forbidden Essence shop upgrade in dungeons, but most likely, the major ways you're going to be increasing your defense is just simply going to be your gear and your armor. I do quickly want to mention hot potato books, since they are quite cheap and do increase your defense by quite a lot, and are applicable to pretty much any scenario, so there's really no reason not to use them. Next up, we have strength. Strength is one of those stats that every single Skyblock player kind of chases their entire profile. No matter if you're early game, mid game, late game, or even end game, strength is always going to be something you're going to be trying to increase. Strength functions quite simply as a damage multiplier. Every 100 strength, your multiplier goes up by 1. The majority of your strength is going to be coming from your gear, just like health and defense. But unlike health and defense, your weapon you're using also matters quite a lot here. Your magical power also has a major influence on the amount of strength you can possibly achieve. As always, the higher magical power is, the more damage you're going to be doing. Other than that, you're going to be gaining minor amounts of strength from stuff like your equipment, your skyblock level, as well as your foraging skill. While this video won't go over how to maximize any of these given stats, I will be giving some general tips on how to increase your damage and survivability at the end of the video. Next up, we have crit damage, which works in conjunction with your strength to increase your overall damage. Functionally, both strength and crit damage are practically identical, both just being a simple damage multiplier, although crit damage only applies to critical hits. Just like with strength, every 100 crit damage you gain, your damage multiplier goes up by 1. An important thing to note when it comes to critical damage and strength is that because they multiply together, you want to try to keep them as balanced as possible, as this will result in the most amount of damage possible. This means that the amount of critical damage you have should roughly equal the amount of strength you have. About a 10% deviation won't matter too much, but much more than that will start seriously hurting the amount of damage you're dealing. This is all assuming, of course, that you can get your critical chance to 100, as if your critical chance is below 100, your critical damage starts mattering less and less. Speaking of critical chance, that's the next stat we're going to quickly take a look at. Critical chance, as its name implies, is simply the chance you have to deal a critical hit. As long as your critical chance is 100 or above, you're guaranteed to crit, and there's really no reason to get more critical chance. Generally, later in the game, you're not going to have an issue getting your critical chance up, as you'll get quite a lot from just the gear you're wearing, your combat skill, as well as a god potion. But there are certain situations where you have to focus a lot more on your critical chance, just as when you're using a Terminator, since it divides your critical chance by 4. In these cases, your best options is simply to use a power stone such as Fortuitous and putting your tuning points into crit chance. Next up, we have bonus attack speed, which is quite a lot more complicated than the other stats we had a look at so far. The gist of it is pretty simple. The higher bonus attack speed is, the faster you can attack. But that's not always the case due to how Minecraft works. In Minecraft, every single enemy you hit gets something called immunity frames. Immunity frames describe how long it takes for you to be able to hit that enemy again. By default in Hypixel, at 0 bonus attack speed, this time is 0.55 seconds or 11 in-game ticks. At the maximum value for melee, 82, this gets reduced all the way down to 0.25 seconds or 5 in-game ticks. This means effectively you can attack twice as fast with 82 bonus attack speeds as you can with 0. This also means that even if you go all the way up to 100 bonus attack speed, you will still only be attacking at the same speed as you were able to with just 82. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because while this is true if you're using melee, attack speed also affects short bows. In these cases, attack speed doesn't reduce the immunity frames your enemies get, but instead reduces the shot cooldown on your short bow. So while the default shot cooldown is half a second, it becomes just 0.25 seconds at 100 attack speed. And yes, now you need 100 attack speed to get the full benefit. Quick little side note, attack speed does also affect the rate at which the Mage Beam in Dungeons procs. This is not too important for the average player, but if you are playing LCM, it is important to know as it can increase your DPS significantly. In general, attack speed is quite hard to get. As a late game player, where you're mainly going to be getting your attack speed from is either going to be from reforges such as Renowned, your tuning points, and your Power Stone. Other than that, you will probably get the majority of your attack speed from something like your pet, like a golden dragon. If you don't have a golden dragon, a crochet tiger plushie is also an option if you don't mind losing knockback immunity. Or if you're really desperate and using melee, you can go for something like the dirty reforge to get a little bit of extra attack speed. If you are struggling with reaching 100 or 82 attack speed, depending on what you're playing, I do suggest swapping to the Renowned reforge and just trying to get your magical power up. And as always, the tiger plushie is also a pretty good option. Good thing for Archer is that if you are running the Terminator, you are going to get a whole 44 attack speed, or 60 if you're in dungeons, from that alone. The next stat we're going to take a look at is Ferocity, which is a little complicated, but simply put, increases the number of times you hit enemies. Every 100 Ferocity you have, you're guaranteed to hit an enemy an extra time. This means that Ferocity can, in practice, be seen as a kind of damage multiplier. Because if you hit an enemy twice as much, they're gonna take twice as much damage. Since Ferocity does give extra hits instead of just being a plain damage multiplier though, it is especially useful against bosses with damage caps such as Ender Dragons and the Endstone Protector, and it also helps with getting through Enderman Slayer's hit phase. Since Ferocity is quite a powerful stat, there's not really that many ways to get it. The main train being either using something like Werewolf Armor or getting the Zombie Brain Mix-In effect on your God Potions. Then there's also specific gears or enchants such as either Fatal Tempo, the Dirty Reforge, the Ferocious Mana enchant, the Shredder, or the ability from the Enderman Slayer Katanas. Other than these though, there is not really many ways to get Ferocity reliably. The next stat we're going to take a look at is Swing Range, which, quite simply put, increases the range you can hit with melee. There are very few ways to actually increase your swing range, the main one being either using something like a longsword, these includes the Giant Sword, the Bone Reaver, or the Dark Claymore, or using the set bonus from the Crimson Armor set, Dominus. Other than these ways, there are no real ways to increase your swing range, and honestly, it's not a really useful stat. The only place where it's very useful is in dungeons, where the extra swing range means you have a larger cone attack, which can be quite useful for clear. The next stat we're going to take a look at is Intelligence, a stat that on the surface looks quite simple, just increasing your magic damage and your mana pool, aka the amount of mana you have. But in reality, it's quite a lot more complicated due to a hidden stat called ability scaling, which every single damage dealing ability has, which controls how much your damage actually increases when your intelligence increases. Since ability damage scaling is unique for every single weapon and ability, I will not be listing them. I will though be leaving a link down below to a Wikipedia article where every single ability damage scaling stat is listed, if you are curious. In terms of where you're going to get intelligence, it's quite similar to the other combat stats, being from mainly your magical power, your gear, including your weapon, a lot more heavily on reforges than something like strength and crit damage, as well as enchants. Other than that, you can get a little bit of intelligence from your skills, as well as attributes, as well as a bunch of minor boosts from various different sources in the game, such as Melody and Slayer. The next stat we're going to look at is ability damage, which is, unlike ability scaling, not hidden, and functions almost exactly like strength does with melee damage, being a flat damage multiplier. Due to how magic damage scales in the game, you can't get very much ability damage, with the only real sources being something like the Wither Goggles, your enchanting skill, and your Power Stone. It is also possible to get a minor boost from your beacon. This next section is going to go over the damage statistic, but also going to go over a bunch of different damage multipliers that aren't really listed anywhere, but still have a major influence on the final amount of damage you end up dealing. The main thing to note here is that there are 3 different types of damage. There's the base damage that your weapon has, such as the 270 my Daedalus Axe has. Then there's a additive damage multiplier, such as the one you get from the Golden Dragon Legendary Treasure perk, as well as something like the Sharpness enchantment, as well as your combat level. And then there's the final type of damage, which is the damage multiplier, which is something like the creature-specific damage multipliers from the Daedalus Axe, as well as the creature-specific damage multipliers from the different Slayer weapons, such as the zombie multiplier from the Exodus Shredded and the Enderman multiplier from the Atom Split Katana. While all of these damage types all help you deal more damage, they interact with your damage a little bit differently. First off, weapon damage can be seen as kind of the base damage you're dealing before any multiplier happens. This is the damage that also gets multiplied by your strength and crit damage. Whereas all sorts of additive damage multipliers all get added together. In this case, the Legendary Treasure perk would get added to my Sharpness perk, as well as my combat level, which would all add together to one larger damage multiplier, which, while not as good as if they had been applied on their own, does result in a sizable damage increase, where then the final multiplicative damage multiplier gets added on at the end, multiplying your damage with exactly how much it says on that specific multiplier. Let's try with a very simple example. In this case, we have an end sword with a base damage of 35. That gets multiplied by our strength and crit damage. In this case, for simplicity, let's say we have 100 strength, 100 crit chance, and 100 crit damage. The 100 strength multiplies it to 70. Then we get the guaranteed critical hit, meaning our critical damage multiplies it by 2, and we end up dealing 140 damage. We want to increase that, so we end up putting Ender Slayer and Sharpness on it, as well as start using it on actual Endermen. We are also combat level 25, which means we deal 100% more damage to mobs. In this case, we have 3 different additive damage multipliers. The one from our combat level, the one from our Sharpness enchant, and the one from the Ender Slayer enchantment. All these added up ends up with an additive damage multiplier of 245%. This then gets multiplied on top of our damage. In this case, that means it's going to be a damage multiplier of 3.45, which means our damage gets boosted all the way up to 483. At this point, our multiplicative damage multiplier from the Endstone Sword's ability gets added, multiplying our damage by another 100%, meaning we just have to multiply that by 2, which means we ends up dealing a final damage of 966. I know this is a little bit complicated, and it's completely fine if you don't completely understand it. It's not necessary at all to play the game and have a lot of fun, but for any of you who was curious, I hope this little example clarified it a little bit. At this point, we have basically gone over every single stat that affects your damage, and we only have a couple survivability stats left to go through. So the next one we're going to take a look at is True Defense, which works almost exactly like defense, just against true damage, which, for those who don't know, specific creatures and bosses in this game deal a different sort of damage called true damage, which completely ignores your normal defense, which means it's only your normal health and your true defense that actually protects you against this damage. Specifically against Sven Slayer and Blaze Slayer, true defense can be quite important. Generally, true defense is quite hard to get, with the best ways being wearing something like Sora armor, making use of enchantments such as True Protection, Reflection, as well as Kenyanji. I probably completely butchered that, but this enchantment for your equipment, as well as just having a God Potion. Opal Gemstones can also grant a nice amount of True Defense, and you also get a small amount from Inferno Demon Lord Slayer. An important thing to note about True Defense is that it doesn't protect you against normal damage, that defense protects you against, which means your True Defense doesn't matter in a lot of situations where you're only taking normal damage. It only works against true damage. The next stat we're going to take a look at is Health Regen, which increases the amount of health you regenerate naturally over time. It's generally not that powerful, since basic regeneration is really not that good, but it can be a nice boost to your survivability anyway. Like a lot of the remaining statistics, there's not really that many ways of increasing your health regeneration. Everyone starts with a base value of 100, and the only real ways to increase this is using something like a different regeneration effect you get from the God Potion or Dungeon Pots, and getting your Revenant Horror Slayer level up. You can also get a little bit extra from various different talismans, as well as the Rejuvenate enchant. Going from one underwhelming statistic to the next, we have Mending. Mending, simply put, increases the amount of healing you heal to other players. The only real use case this has is for healer in dungeons. Otherwise, it's pretty much useless. The only real ways of getting Mending is using something like the Holy Dragon armor set, wearing something like a Mender Crown in dungeons, and using something like a Overflux Power Orb. Most of the time, mending is never really worth going for, and you'd much rather go for its sister statistic, Vitality, which is the final stat that we're going to be talking about. Vitality, simply put, increases all the healing you get from pretty much every single source in the game, including your own health regen, including healing from a power orb, including healing from something like the glass cloak, which, as you can imagine, makes it very, very good, especially at keeping you alive. With it being so powerful, there's also really not that many ways you can increase it. Everyone starts with a base 100 vitality, and the only really good way of increasing it is going to be through attributes, which you can get on any sort of equipment that supports them, and your armor. Other than that, there's the Unbreaking Essence Shop perk, which is one of the best Essence Shops perk, as well as the Bloodchoke Reforge that you can get on something like a cloak, which is very, very good on something like the gas cloak. A good way of getting a little bit of extra vitality is also using the Quantum Enchant, which is pretty cheap, so you should pretty much just slap that on any necklace you can get your hands on. And that's all of them. I'm quickly going to go over a couple of general tips or just increasing your damage or increasing your survivability, as well as quickly giving you an idea of what stats you should be worrying about and what stats are less important. As you might have noticed, I have pretty much completely been avoiding talking about pets throughout this entire video, and that's for a very good reason. While pets in general are extremely powerful, both for increasing your survivability or increasing your damage, they can be quite one-sided and can require you to spend quite a lot of resources on getting them. Personally, I recommend everyone should have at least one damage pet and one survivability pet. In general, I'd recommend the Golden Dragon pet for the damage. If you can't afford that, something like a lion is also a really, really good option for the earlier game. Otherwise, for survivability, something like a baby yeti or a blue whale are great options. If you have the funds, getting a all-around pet such as an Ender Dragon or for the Crimson Isle Blaze pet can also be a really, really good option, especially for Demon Slayer for the Ender Dragon and Blaze Slayer for the Blaze pet. And while I could talk about all the different kinds of pets you should have your hands on and you should be using, I'm going to limit it to just these, since this video is already getting pretty long and I will be talking about all the other stats in the future. With that being said, what kind of stats should you be worrying about then? As I also briefly mentioned, if you're going for melee or bow damage, what you should be worrying about is your strength and your crit damage, as well as increasing your hidden additive damage multiplier through either something like a Golden Dragon pet, a Warden helmet, or better enchants, and of course making sure that both your strength and your crit damage are at least somewhat balanced. Otherwise, for Slayers, attack speed is an absolute must. Ferocity can help, but generally most Slayer bosses have some kind of immunity to Ferocity, and it can be quite hard to get it. So I'd suggest just focusing on getting your attack speed up and getting your crit damage and strength up. If you are running Kudra with something like a Term, getting your Ferocity up with something like the Fatal Tempo enchant can be a very good option as well. Otherwise, if you're playing Mage, obviously getting your intelligence up is an absolute must, and getting your ability damage up as high as possible can help you greatly as well. When it comes to survivability, it's a little bit more unclear because it very much depends on the task you're doing. If you're doing something like Blaze Slayer, focusing on your true defense is a lot more important than in other parts of the game. Unlike if you're doing something like Eman Slayer, where your true defense almost doesn't matter at all, and you should be purely focusing on getting your health and your defense up. Otherwise, having a good amount of vitality can also help greatly, especially if you have a decent power orb, and making use of something like the glass cloak for extra healing, as well as getting something like the Vampire Dentist Relic, which can help increase your regeneration greatly. Getting damage reduction from something like the Dojo Belts with their impact or specific talismans can also help greatly with enhancing your survivability. Overall, you shouldn't worry too much about your health regen, but getting Rejuvenate on your armor pieces can be a good idea to give you a little bit of extra healing, especially since it does get enhanced by vitality. And as always, you pretty much shouldn't worry about mending at all. And before I end this video off, I do quickly want to mention hot potato books again, because they are honestly the greatest way to both increase your damage and your survivability with minimal cost. While they do only apply to a single item at a time, the damage boost and the survivability boost they grant can be absolutely huge, and are especially good at just getting you over that edge that allows you to start sacrificing some of your health for damage. And that's the final thing I'm going to talk about briefly, and that is Skyblock is pretty much all about sacrificing your health for damage, or vice versa. In certain activities, your health doesn't matter at all, and then it's all about getting the maximum amount of damage as possible, while in a lot of others it matters greatly and can, more often than not, be more beneficial for you to sacrifice a little bit of damage just to have better survivability, so you can be more consistent in doing something like your Eman Slayer boss. And then slowly over time, as your setup improves, get that damage back. And that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about today. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a little bit different to the other videos I've been posting. There will be more Storage Lock coming out very, very soon. Otherwise, I am also streaming a lot more consistently and will be streaming a lot more consistently over this next week. I am aiming for a stream every other day. While that might not be exactly possible, I hope to see you there either way. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I will see you in the next one. Oh yeah, and if you do enjoy it, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe so I can see that I should be making more of this kind of content. Otherwise, bye!